people in this room that don't know me, and really that's not important. What is important is I, like everybody in this room, is a very close friend of Frank Valenti. I'm a softball teammate, very close friend of Frank. You'll pardon me if I have trouble getting through this, because I'm speaking of a friend whom we all dearly love. Frank was a softball teammate, opponent, competitor, team manager, and traveling buddy for many, many years. He was our third baseman. In his day, one of the best. He was famous for diving in front of a hot ground ball and coming up throwing. In his last tournament, he did not make an out. He hit 1,000 for the whole tournament, jacked one out of the park. He made 3 diving catches at third base, and 2 of them he threw a guy out by laying on his back. He never came home without dirt on his shirt. He could be counted on to deliver a hit when the team needed it. Screaming line drives, smoking grounders, booming shots too, and often over the fence. Frank was a level-headed, knowledgeable, unflappable, high-value player whom we all respected. He was the epitome of a ball player. It was during those softball travels that we learned to appreciate Frank's unique sense of humor. Bear with me as I recall a few of his countless memorable moments. There were 6 of us, half our senior softball team, who traveled throughout Florida to pursue our passion, a game that we all learned as boys. While the ball games in various cities were the reason we traveled, the good-natured joshing during the drive to and from was the highlight of each month's tournament. What one guy didn't think of, someone else would, and someone else would turn it into something hilarious. Frank was our driver. Frank wasn't a particularly good driver, but he had the largest vehicle. So we closed our eyes and rode. Frank liked to look for wildlife on those drives, and really didn't care which side of the road he drove on, while he watched for deer and turkeys and hogs. I have a lot of pictures, some of which were on the screen, taken over his shoulder as he drove us along country roads and around curves on the wrong side of the road. When challenged about his driving, he would continue to straddle the center line and remind us that he, quote, paid taxes for both sides of the road. During those drives, Frank's quiet, deadpan delivery often scored with a comment that made the whole band rock with laughter. Consider these. We were winding our way through Celebration, south of Kissimmee. Marty Jacobson, riding shotgun, asked, "Which way are we going anyway?" Frank began looking out each window, twisting to one side, then to the other, out the windshield, at the sky. After 2 or 3 minutes, he said, "We're going west." Marty looked in and out and all around and asked, "How do you know that?" So Frank calmly told him, "I looked at the compass on the rearview mirror."
He's smiling.
Mark Gaskins would usually sleep during our drives. He woke up once while we were on a back road, and Frank commented, "Mark, you just missed it. We saw a hen weigh." Mark bit and said, "What's a hen weigh?" So Frank told him, "About 2 or 3 pounds." Another trip, same scenario. Mark woke up. Frank lobbed another sucker line at him. "Mark, you just missed it. A tie cloth just flew by." Half asleep and afflicted with a short memory, Mark bid again. "What's a tie cost?" Frank told him, "Oh, about $8 at the mall." Frank was always a practical joker. He once stole Mark Gaskins' softball shoes. Mark was frantic, searching the whole car. After a solid 10 minutes of Mark's escalating panic, Frank pulled the shoes out of his own bat bag and asked, "Whose are these?" As Frank returned the small size 6s, he asked, "What are you going to do with these? Have them bronzed?" But we made it to and from each tournament, safe and sound. We played our games, enjoyed something cold as we changed shoes, stored our gear, and continually teased Frank about his driving. Frank was recently enshrined as the first member of the Brevard Super Senior Softball League's Hall of Fame. In his acceptance speech, his last words to the players gathered to honor him were, "Play ball." Those are the times, the moments that we remember about Frank. The good times, the fun times, the times that we'll miss. The times we will revisit each time we sink our spikes into the red clay of the field of dreams that we once shared with one of God's greatest gifts to the human race. Finally, Frank was a veteran, having served with the Army in Vietnam. Like most of the men of our generation, I too am a veteran. Bear with me as I pay tribute to one of America's soldiers. Rest in peace, my friend.
Wow. That's a rough act to follow, isn't it? These guys are good. I'll do my best. Hello, my name is Joe McAneney, and I'm going to speak this evening about our friend Frank Valenti. On behalf of myself and the company I work for, American Total Protection. Frank was a wealth of knowledge and valuable commodity at ATP. Everyone was always pulling on Frank's time for their various needs. This would define a typical day at work. Always and without exception, Frank would make time for you. Although Frank's recognized expertise was fire alarm and low voltage trade in general, he was not limited to this. My questions were never about those items, though. Instead, they were more about business rules, regulations, requirements as they apply to the license. This stuff is a big deal, Frank would say to me, and you need to get it right. Frank had a real love for what he did in his work, and he would remind me saying, "This is about life safety, man." But more than that, I'd have to say that his genuine respect for what he did was what it was all about. All the time he would say and remind us all, saying, when we did it right, we'd save lives. If we got it wrong, people could die. Frank's work ethic was truly legendary. From the people whom he worked with, to the fire marshals, to the city inspectors, to our competition in business, everyone had mutual respect in Frank Valenti. I can remember several years ago at a cookout in my neighborhood, there was a person who was involved in another fire alarm company here locally. He'd been there for years. When I told him where I worked, he said, "Well, there are a few companies in the state that care more about people than money, and yours is one of them." This guy went on to boast how his company was very competitive, and he'd at some point actually worked with Frank. And he's quick to say, without a doubt, Frank did it right. Frank's all about the life safety aspects of his jobs. Then he went on to describe a certain proud camaraderie between the two. Feeling like he was pumping up our company more than his own, he then said to me, "Well, ATP does good work, I'll give you that." Knowing Frank from my angle, this guy verified what I already knew. In an email that was forwarded to me from a coworker, Karen, it read, "I'm certainly sorry to hear of his loss. Frank was a great wealth of knowledge and resource for the fire alarm industry. He helped me both personally and professionally, and did so happily and willingly. Sadly, a hole exists in our local fire alarm industry that will be difficult to fill, if ever. One thing is for sure, he is in heaven right now telling St. Peter the air is a fire alarm is required by code." That was from Dave Abernathy, Operations Commander, Fire Marshal up in Satellite Beach. Mary, another coworker, emailed me this saying, "Please, if you refer to him as a great teacher, he loved teaching the text and he was very patient and wanted me and Steph to always understand the whys and the hows of everything. I'm sure that he'll be teaching soon. Mayor's email gave me a chuckle because I knew it was true. Frank used to invite me to some of his technical classes. I remember setting up a camera comparison with Frank. He'd give me the blind test, then he'd say, I know which one's supposed to be better, but you tell me which one's supposed to be better. So I asked him, is this a trick question? And he said, hell yes, it's a trick question. But how are we supposed to sell it if we can't answer that question? I was always fascinated by the ever-changing technologies in our industry. Frank encouraged all our curiosities and would have classes for our sales staff to make sure that we understood how things worked. Frank used to say, who doesn't want security? And he'd continue on to say, you need to just explain it to them in a language that they'll understand. Our products sell themselves. As you all know, Frank was a firecracker too. Never afraid to speak his mind, Frank had a way of expressing himself. I can recall he and Paul having some lively discussions, and at the end of the day, it all got sorted out. He could turn the heat up, that's for sure. But in the end, it wouldn't last. I remember Frank would encourage us all to speak our minds because he genuinely wanted to know, even if he didn't agree. This was an attribute, excuse me, this was an attribute of his that in my mind made him a true leader. Swift to listen, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Frank was an athlete for his entire life, as you all know. An avid baseball player in his younger years, and at the office he was never short of stories about his softball team. The league, the Brevard Super Senior League, kept him busy many nights and weekends. And Frank would get fired up telling us about the games and the rivalries, smiling ear to ear as he told us those stories. Earlier this year, Frank was the league's first Hall of Fame inductee, which he was very proud of. I traded some cuttings of plumeria and exotic flowering vines with Frank about a year ago. And about a month ago, he sent me a text with pictures showing me how well that they did. Frank really loved his plants as well. A lot of people didn't know that side. Frank had done his share of traveling too, and as a veteran of the Vietnam conflict, he saw his share of Asia, he told me. He also traveled to Central and South America, and he shared with us in the office the many pictures that he had taken from his Indiana Jones-like visits to the ruins there. It was back in the 70s, I'm guessing. Of all the attributes that Frank had, the one I remember him most by is that he was a mentor. If you were lucky enough to have spent the kind of time with Frank, he'd teach you a little something about fire alarms, work ethic, salesmanship, the weather, marriage, sports, and life in general. At ATP, we were all that lucky. And speaking for those in the office and those who worked in the field with Frank, we're going to miss our mentor, our friend and our leader, Frank Rocco Valenti. He'd like this blue folder, by the way.
I have a message from Debbie that she would like me to read to you. From the moment of Frank's diagnosis, our lives changed in dramatic and heartbreaking ways. But throughout the following months, we found ourselves extremely fortunate to have so many loving people in our lives. The first question Frank had after learning of his cancer was, "Can I play ball?" If you know anything about Frank, that should not surprise you. His ball buddies stayed present in our lives from beginning to end, calling, texting, visiting, and offering support to the both of us. Words cannot express how he felt when you honored him by inducting him into the Brevard Super Senior Softball Hall of Fame. To be with his friends one last time out in that ball field, to walk tall, shake hands, and just be present and touch them deeply. Thank you, Mark, for working so hard to make that happen, and for all of you who were there. Thanks to Josie, Frank's sister, who came down from